They tossed her bag like it meant nothing, unaware it carried the power to destroy everything they stood on. The terminal buzzed with the usual noise of boarding calls and rolling luggage, but in that moment, silence dropped like a weight. She stood still, unmoving, as the navy blue bag skidded across the cold floor, its contents slightly spilling. A single stethoscope slid out and twirled like a question mark on the ground. Dr. Ayanna Russell said nothing. Her lips remained pressed together, her expression unreadable. Just a quiet gaze filled with disappointment, not shock, because this wasn't the first time dignity had been mistaken for invisibility. The flight crew smirked, turned away, already, moving on to their next directive. They didn't know, not yet, but that single moment, so quiet, so careless, would go on to unravel a billion-dollar insurance contract and flip an entire airline's future. You won't believe how one silent moment changed everything. But before we dive in, tell us where. You're watching from, because no matter where you are, respect is universal. Dr. Ayanna Russell walked with the grace of someone who had long mastered the art of carrying both purpose and pain in silence. Her steps were slow but assured, the rhythm of a woman who had walked through countless hallways of prejudice without ever letting it alter her posture. Her coat, crisp and white, clung gently to her frame, brushing softly against her worn leather. A bag with scuff marks at the corners, seams faded by time, but still whole. That bag had followed her through emergency rooms in war zones, research panels in Geneva, and boardrooms where she was often the only woman, let alone the only black one. It wasn't just luggage, it was a quiet chronicle of her worth, carried, not for display, but survival. Across the terminal, Captain Dana Whitmore stood tall near the crew gate, uniform pressed to military precision, every gold stripe gleaming beneath the airport's sterile lighting. She exuded discipline and command, the kind that made others fall in line before she spoke. She wasn't unkind, at least not deliberately, but her pride in her position had hardened into something less forgiving. Dana saw order. She saw ranks, and anything or anyone outside her immediate structure was, to her, a problem to manage, not understand. She didn't believe she was prejudiced. She simply believed in protocol. The irony, of course, was that her lens was so polished it had grown blind spots. The airport around them was sleek and unfeeling, gleaming floors reflecting pale artificial lights, silver gates stretching like mechanical arms, voices echoing over the intercom with sterile urgency. It was a place built to move people, not see them. A world where efficiency often drowned empathy. Ayanna stood quietly near the medical access. Lane, eyes on the terminal map, her ID badge clipped neatly beside her stethoscope. Inside, her thoughts were not on the flight ahead but on the moment she knew might come. The moment where someone, somewhere, would decide she didn't belong. She had experienced it in subtler forms. Questions asked twice, doors held open for others but not her, credentials scrutinized as if they were counterfeit. And yet, every time she smiled and stepped forward, this time would be no different. Or so she told herself. But beneath her calm was a pressure she rarely admitted. Not from the altitude she was about to reach, but from the gravity that always pulled her down before takeoff. Ayanna didn't travel as a passenger. She traveled as a warning unspoken, a quiet storm, waiting, watching, not to rage, but to reveal. Ayanna approached the gate marked Medical Priority Clearance with quiet precision, her boarding pass already loaded on her phone, her credentials prepared like clockwork. She moved into the lane with the poise of someone who had done this before, because she had, dozens of times. And yet, just 3 steps in, a voice sliced through the noise behind her. "Excuse me, ma'am," a flight attendant said, her tone clipped, but not yet confrontational. "This lane is for authorized medical personnel only." Ayanna turned, her face calm. "I am authorized," she said gently, lifting her ID badge. It was hospital-issued, laminated, and clipped to her lapel, swaying slightly with the movement. Before the attendant could respond, Captain Dana Whitmore appeared behind her, walking briskly as if hurrying to fix a problem only she could solve. Without asking questions, without even a glance at Ayana's badge, she stepped forward and snatched the duffel bag from Ayana's shoulder. "You need to wait like everyone else," she said firmly, her voice echoing just enough to draw glances. "I was cleared for this lane," Ayana replied, her tone steady, no trace of anger, only truth. Dana didn't hear it, or didn't care. She turned, dismissing the moment as routine, and dropped the bag to the floor beside her feet with the casual authority of someone used to being obeyed. The bag hit the ground with a dull thud. A stethoscope slipped out of the half-zipped pocket, coiling on the cold tile like a fallen ribbon. Time seemed to pause. There was no shouting, no outrage, just silence. A silence so deep it pressed against the edges of the terminal like invisible glass. Ayana didn't move immediately. She stood still, eyes on her bag, her breath controlled. Around her, the crowd began to move again, as if the interruption had been nothing more than static in the routine. She stepped forward, knelt, and gently picked up the stethoscope first, cradling it with practiced care, then the bag, brushing off a faint streak of dirt with her palm. There was no trembling in her hands, no flinch in her posture, just a slow, composed recovery. She didn't look back at Dana. She didn't speak another word, but someone else noticed. At a distance, near a wall of tinted windows, a man in a charcoal suit with a small gold pin on his lapel watched the scene unfold. His eyes hadn't left Ayana since she entered the lane. As she walked away, the weight of her silence trailing behind her like an invisible veil, his expression shifted, from passive observation to sharp, quiet alarm. Ayana didn't see him. She didn't need to. Some moments don't require an audience to matter. But that moment, in all its brutal simplicity, had been seen, and everything had just begun to change. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that feels empty, but the heavy, suffocating kind that wraps around you like cold fog. The compliance office was designed that way. White walls, no windows, no distractions. A long glass table sat in the center, flanked by high-backed chairs that offered no comfort. Everything in the room was sterile, like an operating room without life, and it carried the symbolism of judgment, of truths stripped of all distractions. Captain Dana Whitmore stepped inside, her footsteps sharp against the polished floor. Her uniform was immaculate, buttons gleaming under the clinical lights. She carried herself with the rigid confidence of someone who had spent years climbing ladders without missing a step. She glanced around, expecting to see an HR rep or a mid-level executive ready to ask a few procedural questions and send her on her way. Her jaw tightened slightly as she took her seat. To her, this was nothing more than a misunderstanding, something her record could easily absorb. The door opened again. She turned, and her entire spine stiffened. Dr. Ayana Russell entered slowly, calmly, like she belonged there. She wore a tailored suit, no longer the white coat of the passenger she had appeared to be. Her ID badge now bore not just her name, but her full title, Global Director of Medical Compliance and Insurance Audit. Behind her trailed a senior executive and a legal observer, both silent. Dana blinked. She started, but stopped. Ayana sat across from her, folded her hands, and looked her in the eye. There was no malice there, no need for raised voices or revenge, just gravity. "You didn't just toss my bag," she said, her voice steady, low. "You tossed your future." The words landed with more force than any reprimand Dana had ever received in her career. Her throat tightened. The air in the room, once clinical and clean, now felt thick with consequence. Dana glanced. around as if searching for a handhold. "I didn't know who you were," she said, her voice softer, the edge gone. Ayanna tilted her head slightly. "That's exactly the point." There was a pause. Not awkward, deliberate. Ayanna let the silence settle like dust on glass. The executive placed a thick folder on the table and slid it across. Dana opened it, slowly. Inside were legal documents, a correspondence chain, and a termination notice from the airline's primary international insurance provider. At the center of it all was a flagged note. "Incident of bias and violation of medical protocol, observed firsthand by our senior compliance partner. Effective immediately, insurance renewal is revoked." Dana's eyes widened. She skimmed the papers, desperate for a misprint or a loophole. This can't be right. This is our entire coverage for overseas operations." Ayanna nodded once. $520 million in coverage. Gone, because a medical professional you didn't recognize was deemed unimportant enough to humiliate. Dana's mouth opened slightly, but no words came. She wasn't used to being the one without control. She had flown through storms, landed emergency routes, dealt with unruly passengers, but nothing had ever made her feel as grounded as this moment. "I wasn't trying to—" she started. "Exactly," Ayanna replied. "You weren't trying. You were assuming." The fluorescent lights above cast Dana's reflection faintly on the polished table surface. She didn't recognize the woman staring back. Ayanna stood, calmly gathering the documents. "I'm not here to shame you," she said. "I'm here to ensure this never happens again. To anyone." The door opened. Ayanna paused in the doorway, her back to Dana. "Silence isn't weakness, Captain. Sometimes it's just a different kind of strength." And with that, she left. Dana remained seated, her hands trembling slightly, not from anger, but from something unfamiliar: accountability. For the first time in her career, she wasn't the voice giving orders. She was the echo of a moment she could no longer take back. The tension in the compliance room didn't dissolve after Ayanna left. It lingered like smoke in the air, curling into the corners of Dana's thoughts. Hours later, she sat alone in her office, the blinds half closed, the silence almost unbearable. Her sharp edges had dulled. The weight of the meeting was still pressing into her chest. She replayed every second of the encounter, every word, every pause, and most of all, the moment she dropped that bag. A follow-up debrief was scheduled. This time, it wasn't in a formal boardroom, but in a quiet observation lounge overlooking the runway. Ayanna sat there, alone, looking out at the tarmac as planes came and went beneath the evening light. The sky was streaked with gold and lavender, soft and vast, a contrast to the walls Dana usually felt safest behind. She approached slowly, heels no longer echoing with command. Just footsteps now. Human. Ayanna didn't turn as Dana arrived, but she spoke as if she'd been expecting her. "Wasn't traveling," she said quietly. "I was auditing your crew. For behavioral compliance. We were reviewing if renewal was even an option." Dana stopped short. "You were here for us?" Ayanna finally looked over. Her gaze was not harsh, just clear. The incident at the Eye Gate wasn't the only red flag, but it was the one I couldn't ignore. Dana swallowed. Her voice faltered. "If I had known who you were—" Ayanna raised an eyebrow gently. "Then you'd have acted differently?" The words hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Dana's breath caught. She couldn't answer. "That's the problem," Ayanna continued, her tone calm, almost reflective. "Respect shouldn't require introductions. Dignity shouldn't depend on titles." Dana felt the armor crack. Thin at first, then deeper. All the years she had stood tall in her rank, believing she saw everyone equally, shattered in the reflection of that one question. She looked away, ashamed, but Ayanna wasn't finished. "I've always loved flying," Ayana said, eyes drifting back to the window. The stillness of the clouds, the freedom above judgment. But down here, we're all still learning to rise. And dignity, she said softly, should never be checked with baggage. The poetic weight of the moment wasn't lost on either of them. The hum of an aircraft engine rumbled in the background. The lounge lights dimmed slightly as dusk settled over the airport. Dana lowered her gaze. For once, she didn't have an answer, and for the first time in a long time, she realized how much she didn't know. Ayana didn't seek apology. She didn't need validation. The revelation had already done its work, not just in the airline's policy, but in the slow unraveling of a woman who had led by discipline but forgotten compassion. A transformation had begun, and this time it started with silence. Weeks passed, and the quiet ripples from that single moment in the terminal had grown into waves of change. The airline, once celebrated for its efficiency and punctuality, now found itself at the center of a different conversation, one rooted in humanity. Headlines didn't scream scandal. They whispered something rarer: reform. Under the guidance of Dr. Ayana Russell, the company launched a new initiative called Dignity Protocols, a sweeping, company-wide training program centered not on procedure, but on perception. It was the first of its kind, empathy-based, training for all crew and leadership, designed to rewire the way staff engaged with passengers and, more importantly, with one another. Ayana led the effort not with anger, but with clarity. Her workshops didn't begin with blame. They began with listening. She spoke not as a victim, but as a visionary. In meeting rooms and training halls, she walked people through the psychology of respect, how subtle gestures could erode dignity, or uphold it. Her words were never dramatic, but they sank in deep, like water through stone. Dana Whitmore had not been fired. That would have been easy. Instead, she had been grounded, pulled from her captain's chair and asked to shadow Ayana through every session, every meeting, every hallway walk where stories unfolded quietly and lessons were absorbed not through slides, but through stillness. At first, Dana felt stripped, exposed. But as the days wore on, she began to see the world through a lens that didn't belong to her rank, but to her humanity. She listened. She asked questions. She sat in silence when others spoke of things that once made her defensive. During one particular session, a young flight attendant stood up and, with hesitant eyes, said, "We saw it. We saw what happened to her at the gate that day. But we didn't know what to say, or if we could say anything at all." The room fell still. Ayana smiled softly, not with triumph, but with understanding. "That's where it starts," she replied, "not with perfect answers, but with noticing, with the courage to care, even when it's uncomfortable." In the months that followed, the culture at the airline began to shift, not overnight, not with fireworks, but with quiet moments of accountability and effort. Eye contact that lasted longer. Names remembered. Apologies offered unprompted. Uniforms were still worn, schedules still followed, but there was a softness now, a human texture beneath the metal and polish. At the annual board presentation, Ayana stood at the podium, her speech brief but powerful. Her old leather bag, now carefully restored, rested on the table beside her. It had become more than a symbol. It was a testament, not to the humiliation she endured, but to the dignity she carried through it. The same bag that had once been tossed aside now stood beside her like an old friend, witnessed by executives, crew, and stakeholders from across the globe. And beside her, standing just slightly to the left, was Dana, not in uniform, not giving commands. She stood with her hands folded, her shoulders less square, her eyes softer, humbled, learning, changing. She didn't speak that day. She didn't need to. Her presence beside Ayana was a statement in itself. Transformation is possible, but only when ego gives way to empathy. Ayana closed her talk with a line that stayed with everyone who heard it. "Change doesn't come from yelling louder," she said. "It comes from being heard, without raising your voice." And in that room full of executives in uniforms, you could hear a pin drop. Respect had finally found its volume, not in sound, but in action. She boarded alone, carrying more than luggage. She carried years of resilience folded neatly beside quiet hope, wrapped in the fabric of experience that too many choose not to see. And when they tossed her bag, they didn't just disrespect her. They tried to discard the weight of everything she had earned. But she didn't push back with anger. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she walked through that moment, with the same poise she carried through every storm. And in doing so, she shifted the skies above an entire airline. She left carrying change. Not revenge, not validation, just quiet, undeniable change. Have you ever stayed silent while someone disrespected you, only to rise above with grace, knowing your worth didn't need to be shouted? Like this story, if you believe dignity isn't something to be earned. It's something that should be honored. Share it if you know someone who's had to carry their strength in silence. Let this story remind the world, real power doesn't always make noise. Thank you for watching. Stay close, because the next story we tell may be yours.